that it's 12 o'clock. So as people are still logging on and getting their sound connected, we'll continue to let people in the chat room as they arrive. But we are going to go ahead and get started today. This is the last part of our Lunch and Learn series that we've been running for the last several weeks. And this is a topic we're really or a session we're really looking forward to. We just kind of titled it Ask the Educator. And we have a short presentation, but then we hope that you have a lot of questions to bring to us that we can possibly help you with. So with that, Mark Kepler is going to start us off today. So it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much. A good opportunity to speak with you and talk about a variety of things. So our plans today is to have you type into the chat box what your questions might be. And anything that's going on out there, any issue that's out there that's in the line of plants and insects, diseases, those types of things. As we get to this time of year, all those things accumulate, and there's a whole lot of problems in our landscape. And so what I thought I would do this morning is I would start out with just some general things that I've been dealing with here, and so we can get the ball rolling along that line. And so the first thing I'm going to pull up is this slide. And let me get my slide set here, slideshow from beginning. All right, well, I got this call this morning already, and I've had it a couple times, and that is the big old hornet's nest is showing up, and the person this morning had a hornet's nest in their shed so that when they opened the door that they hadn't opened for a while, they ripped the hornet's nest apart, and out come all the hornets and just swarmed them. And so that wasn't a good situation by any means. So let's talk about bees and what's going on in this world with bees. So one of them with hornets are, you understand that there are two types of bees in this world. There are social bees and there are solitary bees. And what a social bee is they give them that name because they protect their nest. And they will fiercely protect their nest. And a hornet is a social bee, a honeybee, and a yellow jacket are all examples of ones that are social bees that protect their nest. Then there are the other kind of bees out there that are solitary. They live on their own, they do things on their own, and there's hordes of these little kind of bees, and most of them are fairly small. And because they're fairly small in the environment, people don't even notice them, and they rarely ever sting you. Because I always tell people you virtually have to set on them to get stung by them. And those are the solitary bees that are out there. So with a hornet, what ends up happening is only the queen overwinters. And so starting off in the spring of the year with just a queen, they develop and they develop and they eventually develop to the point where there could be 1,000 different hornets in that nest. And in the last several weeks, that nest is just grown precipitously in the number of hornets that are in it, and there's getting to be a lot of them in there. So we're getting more conflicts going on with this time of year with those. And so that hornet will, like I said, fiercely defend its nest. And so that's what we have to watch out for. If that hornet's nest is way up into a tree, it's not a big deal. In fact, many times when the leaves drop off the tree come the fall of the year, we look up there and we see there's a hornet's nest up there, and it's not causing any problems. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to, because we're not going to be around it. People aren't going to be around it. Versus that hornet's nest that's really next to things right next to the ground. And that's where we have to worry about those kind of nests that are in that situation. So people say, well, what do I do about this? Well, sometimes they go down to the store and they buy that can of wasp spray that shoots out 20 foot, and that will work on a hornet's nest. And when you stand back and you just sit there and just absolutely soak the nest with that kind of a spray, that will work. But what about another guy? What about another one that doesn't build such a nest that we can see it? And that's the guy on the right, and that's a yellow jacket. Yellow jackets will also do the exact same thing. They build up huge populations by this time of year. They could have a nest in the ground, and it could be out mowing, and I did this a couple of years ago, and there was a nest of yellow jackets in the ground where I was mowing at. And so what they can do is they build up these great big numbers also. And how do I do that? Well, I can't spray that stuff down into the ground. It doesn't really work very well for that. And in fact, those insecticides that they put into those cans, I always say that essentially they are, if you take a wasp and you throw gas on them, it'll drop them right to the ground. Well, we really don't go around throwing gas on things, something that's that flammable. But the things that are in that wasp and spray bomb that shoots out 20 foot are petroleum distillates, and they essentially do the same thing as what that gasoline does. And so I could spray that hornet's nest and do that with that, but I can't get that yellow jacket that's in the ground. So what we'll end up doing is 7 dust, the insecticide 7, is an excellent dust for control of bees and yellow jackets. And what we end up doing is puffing the dust into the hole. Now, sometimes these yellow jackets will get into the side of your house, and when they're in the side of your house, people come along and say, oh, I got yellow jackets coming in and out of my house, and they caulk up that hole. Do not ever plug the hole, because once you plug that hole, they have to get out, and the way that they find to get out is into the house. So you never plug the hole when you're dealing with those things. But the 7 dust, if you puff it into that hole, will take care of them, and they'll get it on their wings, and they'll carry it down into the nest that's in the side of your house, and they'll come back and forth, and give it a couple days, and you will wipe out that yellow jacket nest. Interesting thing about these guys, most of the year they're actually fairly good insects. They're predators. They eat other insects. But get this time of year when we start having those outdoor festivals and people have their pop cans around, they switch their diets from meats to sugars, and they like to hang around sugars. They have this thirst for sugars, and so that's why we end up finding them in our pop cans and are an issue this time of year. So that's a little discussion. 7 dust is what I prefer. Even that hornet's nest, my neighbor told me about it, and it does work fairly well. You take a PVC pipe, like a water pipe, like a 1/2 inch, put a little 90-degree elbow on it, put the 7 dust in the elbow, put the elbow up towards that nest and give it a puff, and you blow that 7 dust right into that nest. And you can stand back and you can do that. I still would do it at night when they are not active and puff that dust right into that nest. Works fairly well with that. Then there's this guy. This is the one we're getting more and more calls about, because people think, oh, we've heard about this new hornet that's out there, this mad hornet, this killer hornet that's out. And I've got these in my yard. They're digging holes in my yard. Is that what this is, one of those killer hornets? Well, this is a Cicada killer. It's one of them solitary bees. And in other words, it does not have, and nor does it defend its nest. A Cicada killer goes up, finds a cicada in a tree, stings it, brings it down, stuffs it down a hole it's dug in sandy soil usually, lays an egg on it, and that egg develops and hatches out and consumes that cicada. Cicada isn't dead, it actually eats that cicada alive, and that's how that egg develops. So this is not one of those killer hornets or mad hornets that are out there. In fact, those mad hornets have only been found in Washington, and there was only a couple of them out there, state of Washington, and there were only a couple of them out there, and I think I read just this morning they trapped a male for the first time. So they're not something around our area, so don't worry about the killer hornets yet. But the cicada killers are good guys. In my book, the males cannot sting. The females, again, are something you virtually got to step on in order to get them to, or set on in order to get them to sting. And they, obviously, these things are like 2 inches long, so they're huge, and they can do a lot of flying around and scare people. But they hang around the ground, they hover around the ground, and they have these little individual nests everywhere, and so we don't worry about them so much. So just thought I'd cover a little bit about those guys. It's time of year we really get calls on them. The other call I get this time of year is that wilting squash plant on the right. And that wilting squash plant usually is caused by this guy on the left, which is called a squash vine borer. Earlier this year, as that squash plant we planted in the ground begins to finally take off and start to vine out, the moth, and it's a moth that don't even look like a moth, comes along, lays an egg at the base of that plant. that egg hatches out and develops and eats out the base of that plant. And so as we're going into this time of year, we start to see that plant starting to wilt down. It's kind of too late at this point. There's not a lot you're going to do for this insect. I know people that get razor blades out, cut into the vine at the base of it and cut this guy up and kill him, but a lot of the damage has already been done by this time. So this is a squash vine borer, and probably what you really should have done back when it was just starting to do its growing would have been to use some insecticide on the base of it, and liquid 7 would have probably been the best thing to do there. I'm not a fan of 7 dust except for those wasp insects. When it comes to gardening, I like to use the liquid 7 if I can, because then I don't have all that dust to mess with out there. So squash vine borer coming along on pumpkins and squash, and get on cucumbers, all these different things that it can deal with. Now there's another one that mimics it, and this is a guy called the striped cucumber beetle. So I may have some of my cucumbers or melons that are starting to wilt down, and in this case the striped cucumber beetle, actually what it does is it feeds on those plants, which really doesn't cause much harm, but in the process it has a disease inside of its gut, and it spreads that disease from its gut into that plant, and so I get this same wilting thing that goes on. And so it's really interesting. And here's the neat part about it. This is a bacterial disease that it spreads. In the world of diseases, there are 3 kinds of vectors for the most, or 3 kinds of diseases for the most part, and there's variations of it. In our world, number 1 thing that we have are viruses. So we transmit viruses to each other. We sneeze. We're wearing those masks today because we're potentially transmitting viruses. If we cut ourselves in our wound, we can get a bacterial disease. But the 3rd kind, and very least frequently, is fungal diseases, where we have things like athlete's foot that are funguses. In the plant world, it's just the opposite of that. In the plant world, number 1 are fungus diseases, because they can get up in the air and float over to different plants. Number 2 is bacterial diseases, and again, with bacterial diseases, they need to have some kind of a wound usually to get into it. And the last one is viruses. In the case of a virus, it takes a bug to physically take the virus from one plant to the other plant. It's usually bugs, but it could be other things that do that. Well, this one, striped cucumber beetle, has a bacterial wilt that it spreads, and what that bacterial wilt then is introduced by that beetle into the plant. And I don't have a picture of it, but what we ended up doing is, if you really want to know if that's the problem or not, if I cut that plant in half, put the pieces back together, pull it apart, and when I pull it apart, I look to see if there's little strings developing, and that strings is the bacterial oozing that is developed in there, and we can find that we actually have that in that plant. So these are not good guys. When you start seeing them around your plants, you want to try to spray to control them. The problem is the plant may be in bloom, and so you want to direct your sprays in the evening when the blooms have closed up, and try to put the sprays on at that time to control this thing on our cucumbers and our plants. This is another one coming on strong this time of year. It's called a squash bug. These are immatures. As they get older, they have more of a wing shape on the back of them. And what they end up doing is they get into this and they actually suck the juices out of this plant leaf. And they'll get on your pumpkin or on your squash plants, and they will totally cover it. And these stinky gray bugs, and they are stinky, they do smell, will end up just sucking the juices right out of that plant. Squash bug historically has been controlled with 7, but 7 isn't working most of the time anymore. You have to experiment with some different insecticides to try to control squash bug. They're very difficult. And so I have started to use some of the pyrethroid type insecticides on my place, and they will do a better job of controlling these. If you put a bug spray on like 7 and you go back and they're still there, they're done. forget it. We need to go to a different route and try some other kind of chemical with another type of chemistry involved in it. So that's a squash bug. By the way, they'll spend the winter inside your garage or somewhere else, your shed out there. And so in the middle of the winter, you pull something aside and you'll see them under there and they smell. They really have an odor to them that just permeates your nostrils. And so that's a squash bug. So another thing we're seeing this time of year that is out there, especially on our walnut trees, is that fall webworm. And on the left, we start to see that web that start to develop on there. This is the fall webworm. On the right of the picture we have there, that's a bagworm. People call the thing on the left bagworms, and they are not. Bagworms and webworms are totally separate, different insects. And so what's going on with that webworm, it is a moth that's laid an egg. Those eggs have developed into these webworms. This would probably be the second generation this year we're seeing. So there were some there earlier this summer, and they have since pupated into moths, laid their eggs, and coming on like crazy this time of year. What you do for these guys, if you see a nest like this, if you can reach it, take it out of there, prune it off and go destroy it somewhere, that'll work. Or you can hit it with some of the pyrethroid insecticides. You can spray right into that nest, but that webbing around there, because there's that webbing there, you have a hard time getting through to it. So those insecticides have to get through to that. So that's what you do with it. On the right side, we're looking at bagworms. At this time of year, you see an evergreen tree that's just been totally ate up. You'll go out and you think, oh, those are pine cones. Well, they're not pine cones. Inside of that is a worm. And these guys are starting to shut down already. The damage has been done for this year. And so the best thing you can do at this point is to pick them off by hand, because inside of there will be the female or the male. But what the male's going to do is climb out of his, come over and visit the female and breed her, and she will eventually die with a whole bunch of eggs inside of her. And next year, sometime about the second week of June, those eggs will start to hatch out and develop, and you're going to end up seeing these little tiny worms start to go out there, feed on this case where you've got some arborvitae or a cedar or a white pine. They really like the evergreens, but they will feed on other trees. You know, if their preferences for those evergreen trees, but if there's nothing else to eat, they will feed on some other things and they will start developing. And so you really need to start looking for them about that second week of June. So a little interesting tidbit. This winter, if the temperature gets down below zero and stays below zero for a whole day, that is enough to kill out the eggs of that. That's why this has never been a big issue for us in northern Indiana, where I'm at, and it's always been an issue in central and southern Indiana because we are more apt to get those winters like that. Well, winter seems to be getting warmer, and so we now have this as an issue in our community, and people are not used to seeing these things around where those people in southern Indiana are. So if I get that really cold day this winter, it could really cause an issue with their lifespan. Now, what ends up happening is I'll get that out in the country at my place, but in town it may not get that cold, so people in town will still have issues while the people in the country may not have an issue. That's a bagworm. Left-hand side is a webworm. By the way, that webworm really does not cause a whole lot of extensive damage. The bagworm can kill a tree. Two totally different insects there, two different things they can do. When we come into a tree this time of year and they start eating the leaves off of it, that walnut tree over there, it's not a big deal. That tree's ready to lose its leaves anyway. So it's not going to injure that tree by losing those leaves. But that evergreen, that's a different situation altogether. So what else have I got? Oh, there I got my female. And this is inside of her. And we've cut this open and see all those eggs laying inside of her. That's where she is pupated with those eggs inside of her, and that's how they spend the winter. By the way, the female does not fly, and the male does not fly. They do all this by crawling along, and so that's how we develop. So in the spring, and I should say late spring, as in early June, actually, that thing will come along, hatch out, and develop into tiny little worms. And they will get to your place by doing something I think is very interesting they call ballooning. It will produce a little strand of, of silk coming out of it. And this little tiny worm will then get into the wind, and that little strand will help propel it through the wind, and it will fly along through the wind and come along and come to an area, and that's where it'll get trapped in those evergreens, and that's where it'll stay at, develop, and start feeding away. Really interesting insect. Think about it. It can't fly, but it gets around pretty good, and it does it by that ballooning process. We talked about invasives the other day on our program. This guy is in bloom right now, purple loosestrife. I think you'll see it out in the swampy areas. People look at that and go, man, that is just beautiful. And it is beautiful. But just because it's beautiful doesn't mean it can't do damage. And so as you drive along the roads nowadays, you're starting to see that purple loosestrife. If you see that coming into a wetland area that you own, get out and kill it. Get out in some Roundup or some brush killer. I don't care what it takes. Get this thing killed, because it is something that stops wildlife. It takes over. It is no good. And even though the beauty is there, I encourage you to take a look at that. Invasives we talked about a couple weeks ago, and this is one of them, and we need to start controlling them. Another thing we've gotten a lot of questions on this summer are these Tuliptree scales. People will say, I got a picnic table underneath my tulip tree and it's raining down on me. Well, my tree is leaking. Trees do not leak. What is going on is there's an insect on a tree that's sucking juices in one end and squirting it out the other end. So you can tell what's raining down on you is what's coming out the other end. And there's a lot of insects that will do that, aphids and mites, and in this case, scales. They can be shown on tulip trees. They can get huge numbers. On the left are some females. On the right are some males that are on that tree, and they're sucking the juices out of the tree. And so this is definitely a problem we have coming on all summer long. In the last few weeks, the females that have laid eggs have hatched out, and little things we call crawlers come out from underneath there. And those crawlers then go out and they find a place on the branch, and then they start forming that back on them. Through the juices they're sucking out of that branch, they'll start forming that back. And when we go to spray it, those females on the left and most of the males on the right are protected from them sprays by that shell that covers them. So what we have to use is insecticides that we can dump on the ground, that are absorbed into the ground and that flow up into the tree. So when those guys are taking some juices out of it, they're consuming the insecticide into them. Well, that takes some time. And so a lot of that should have been done several weeks ago, because right now is when them new crawlers are establishing. And I see a lot of failure rate on using insecticides on these Tuliptree scales because there's a timing issue involved. And the product we usually use is an insecticide with the term, the name imidacloprid, and you'd have to talk to your extension educator about where to get it and how to get it. And it is something that can be used on these different ones. Then the other thing I'm seeing right now is apple scab. Tree on the right is with the results of apple scab. Earlier in the spring, that fungus disease has got into crab apples and apple trees, and it's causing those trees now to start turning yellow. The leaves are, or get these blackish areas. They're not really spots, but they're areas on there. And there's my tree on the right that's dying, or not dying, excuse me. It is not dying. It is losing leaves. That tree is perfectly healthy. It'll come back next year, shove out a new set of leaves. Our crabapple trees have taken years after years after years of this disease. It weakens them. So when they do get a little old, it can kill them, but for the most part, they shove back out. This is where we use a fungicide, especially in the early spring, to protect those trees during those rain events. Spray the fungicide before the rain and not after the rain, and that'll protect that tree. And especially if we could get 3 sprays on a couple weeks apart in the spring of the year, we'd go a long way to keeping those leaves on those trees. Unfortunately, many of them trees get big, and so it's very hard to do those sprays. those fungicide sprays. And I like to use a fungicide that goes by the brand name of Daconil. It has a chemical name of chlorothanil, but Daconil, Daconil, is an excellent fungicide to have around for a variety of issues, and they can spray your crabapple trees with Daconil. Apple trees are not to be sprayed with that one, but crab apples can be. And then the last one that I just think is interesting, this happens to be a goldenrod. Now, we don't care about goldenrod, but the goldenrod's in bloom right now. And if you go out to your field of goldenrod, as on the left, you're going to see this big swelling. And this is a gall. And in our world, we have lots of galls. And what ends up happening is an insect comes along, stings it, or does something to this plant as it's growing and causes the plant to deform itself. In this case, this insect, and this is a fly that has laid an egg, and the plant actually forms around that fly. This is unique nature. My gosh, this is incredible stuff. And if you think about it, you have put something into this plant that causes it to deform. And I think you're going to see more and more of these kind of things being utilized for genetic engineering, for maybe even pesticides, because of what they cause plants to do. And this plant is not killed it, but it has formed around it. And on the right, you can cut one of these open, and they're really tough, hard to cut open. Don't cut your fingers in the process. And you'll see on the inside of that is a little white worm that's in there. It's a maggot, essentially, and that is what's developing. Eventually, that maggot will crawl out the side. So later on, you may see a hole in the side of one of these things. And these are gall insects. And we have gall insects on so many different plants where they do this. The next one I have is the horned oak gall. I've got one of these sitting in my office right now from several years ago. It's a wasp that stung it. That is oak tissue that formed around it. Where those little horns come out is actually where the wasp will emerge out of that area. On the right side is an oak apple gall. It forms this big swelling. It looks like an apple on an oak tree. And there again, in the center of it is that little tiny insect that's in there. So I really find these to be very, very interesting. And so I think it's really interesting going on. So those are things that I'm seeing. Stephanie, do we have any questions that I could answer?
Yeah, we actually have quite a few.
Go for it.
So going back, we had a question about bagworms and webworms, and I think you kind of answered it, but just to make sure, someone wanted to know, they haven't necessarily seen webworms on their properties, but is there anything they can do to protect them, kind of to prevent that?
Yeah, no, you don't worry about it. So if you truly got webworms and not bagworms, but if you've got looking for webworms, they get on walnut trees and cherry trees, or certain species they prefer. They come along this time of year, and if I see them up there, if I can reach them, I'll prune them out. If not, they really are not going to hurt the health of the tree. They're just ugly. And I have seen, I've taken pictures of walnut trees and cherry trees that are just totally covered in bags. It looks like something out of a spook show for Halloween time, because there's so many of them on there. And but you really don't worry about them. The plant's going to handle it fine.
Okay, the next question is asking about, from a local standpoint, in Grant, Huntington, and Whitley County areas, where are any buckwheat fields or butterfly gardens where someone could go see monarchs?
All right, somebody else got to answer that one.
Well, I'm in Grant County. I'm the Grant County educator, and Matter Park in Marion does have a butterfly garden where they do a lot of monarch releases and stuff like that. So that would be one place in Grant County. It's on a buckwheat field, but that would be one place you could go see monarchs.
Over here in Howard County, the South Branch of the library actually just started a butterfly garden here this past year, and it's coming along nicely. So if you're wanting to travel a little bit over here in Howard County, you've got a little bit of options as well.
One of the things I find interesting is I come from a farming background. There was the years we always wanted to control and do away with those milkweed plants that are out there, and it has changed considerably. First off, farmers don't have to worry about milkweeds in their fields. Our herbicides cover them fine. So what we got to do is protect our milkweeds growing along our roads and in our fallow areas, and that's what we try to do on our farm too. We try to keep those milkweeds growing for those monarchs.
So another question is pertaining to stink bugs, and how can you control them, prevent them now before it gets cold and they want to come in the house?
So my answer about house is, and this applies to a variety of different things. One of them is ladybugs. With a case of ladybugs, there is usually a day in the fall when it's gotten cold and it's warmed up, kind of that Indian summer day, that they hit the house. And so what I do is I get one of those insecticides. It's in the pyrethroid family, and I like the one that's called bifenthrin, and there's another one called deltamethrin. But lots of times those are found in those home pest controls that you can find at your hardware store in a gallon jug with a hose coming out of it and a squirter at the top. That's where they're found at. I will go around my house in the fall of the year and I will do that spray around there. If I see those stink bugs there, if I see those ladybugs there, that's when I do it at that time of year. And you'll do what you need to do, because once they get in the house, it's just horrendous from there on out. So stop them from getting into your house. Perimeter sprays and up the siding if you can for those things will help you out.
The next question was how to beat Canada thistle.
Yeah. Well, first thing is Canada thistle is something that can be mowed out. So if you got it in your lawn and you continually mow your lawn, you can mow it out. And I say that, but if you got a patch of Canada thistle right next door in your neighbor's field that I call mother plants, that are feeding those other plants underneath, then you can't really do a good job of mowing it out. It won't happen. So Canada thistle is a tough one to deal with. You're dealing with a perennial plant, and it depends on where it's growing at. So let's say it's growing in my garden. The only way you're going to get it is Roundup. And the only way you're going to use Roundup on that is by getting each individual little plant treated with that Roundup. And so that's really difficult to do. I can't spray the whole thing if I've got flowers in there. If it's in a vegetable garden, come the fall of the year, I can take Roundup out there. I can spray the entire garden. The plants, because Roundup has no soil activity. It does not work in the soil. But I'll tell you, with Canada thistle, you can pull all day long, and you're going to leave little pieces of roots behind. That's the one where you can use chemicals to try to get down into it. So one of the things you might try is put on a rubber glove, put on a cloth glove, dip it in your Roundup solution, and wipe it on those Canada thistle. Now, if you got hordes of them, that ain't going to work. But if you got a few of them, that's the best time to think about it. Best time to control Canada thistle is when it's got a bud up there just starting to go into bloom. And that's usually in June sometime. And if you can control it then, that's your best kill. Jeff, do you want to mention yards a little bit? What you think about Canada thistles in yards?
Yeah, so the mowing is definitely a big one. The other thing is if you can get your hands on some clopyralid or triclopure, but that's more of like the when the lawn is right next to the flower bed. And I like the hand dipping one that Mark mentioned, but then I've mentioned a few times too to get a syringe if you don't feel comfortable sticking your hand in there and just dripping it immediately after you cut it. I think digging those out, that's something fun if you have a 5, 6, 7-year-old kid to do. But yeah, digging them out, I've broken many a shovels to try to see how far down I could go with those root systems. So, but yeah, Mark nailed that one pretty good. And I don't know, there was something about with the buds, you don't need as much when they're at that bud stage, as opposed to if you let them get mature and kind of hardened off later in the season. So that bud stage is pretty important.
Okay, the next question was asking Will young trees recover from total leaf scorch?
Okay, let's talk what leaf scorch is. I always think of leaf scorch as the tree having a fever. Now, as a human being, when you have a fever, it doesn't tell you what's wrong. It just says something is wrong. And what scorch is the leaf around the edges of the leaf, it has browned. And what that browning is done is tells me there's something going on downstairs in the roots of that tree. And so that tree is not able to suck up enough moisture. Now, I saw a bunch of maple trees on a 95-degree day and 25-mile-an-hour winds, and you looked at them a couple days later and they were scorched. They couldn't suck up enough water through their roots to keep their end of their leaves on the outside from being damaged. And so that's what leaf scorch is. So it just tells me there's something wrong, but it don't tell me what's wrong. In the case of those maple trees, they were perfectly healthy. So that's a situation where you got to look at all the parameters, what's going on here. Is it a young tree? Did I just plant it recently? Has it been an issue? What has led me to the scorch? So think of scorch as having a fever. That's the right way to think of it. Doesn't say what's wrong, but something is wrong.
So for Japanese knotweed, are there any, I guess, how would you control that? Are there any new treatments, things like that?
I have never seen that up in my area, and I'd have to ask the other educators if they've ever seen it. I guess no. So if that's the situation, so what you do is you understand the biology behind these things. So if I have got Japanese knotweed growing in my grass, for example, generally mowing will take care of a lot of things, but maybe I can apply broadleaf weed killers to try to control it in my grass, and that'll take care of it. So broadleaf weed killers will work on that. If it's somewhere else where I can use Roundup as a herbicide, then I would use that. Roundup kills everything it comes in contact with, and because it does that, it will kill what's out in that area. Now this Roundup thing anymore is gotten a little more difficult than ever, because Roundup has now started to use all different kinds of Roundups. Well, the original Roundup's what I'm talking about. There's Roundup Extended Control, there's Roundup other stuff. And so it's complicating this all together. So for me, I have to see the label of the product to know what I'm dealing with. If it's pure Roundup, which is glyphosate, that is just that and nothing else, then I can deal with that, and I know how to deal with those different products.
So,
Mark,
go ahead.
I just
Sorry.
want to say, Mark, that caused a real headache when they had the Roundup lawn herbicide. And so I'll probably get people confused, but just look and see if it says grass and weed killer or just weed killer. Label is the law. It just takes a little more work on the consumer side.
Yeah, it does. They've really made it very confusing. And people go out and say, well, I got weeds in my grass, so I spray Roundup on there to kill the weeds in my grass. Well, I just took out my grass. It's very, very difficult. So in extension, one of the things we've been taught through the years is try to use them chemical names. And the chemical name for what I'm talking about is glyphosate. I usually spell it out and lay it on a piece of paper. But if it's Roundup Extended Control, it's a totally different product. Or Roundup for lawns, totally different product.
Okay, our next question, this will be a little bit of a guessing game for us, see if we can figure out what it is. It says, I have an oak tree with fuzzy, woolly worm looking things. They don't move and are stuck to the leaf and are spherical in shape. I am not sure what it is. They kind of look like stinging caterpillars, but they don't really know what it is. So does anyone have any ideas?
If there are a variety of ones that can do that, normally they are just a few of them on a tree, not a lot of them. One of them is called a yellowneck caterpillar that can look like that. they are no big deal. They're not going to cause any kind of problems. They're going to eat a few leaves, especially this time of the year. Oak tree can handle that, no problem. They're going to be gone and may never be back again. So those are oddities that you can look at. There's a couple of them that do those things. Don't worry about them.
Okay, our next question is about chlorosis, and do we think that it is more widespread this year, and kind of the causes of that, if you want to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, chlorosis is a yellowing of the leaves where the veins are still green, but the leaves themselves are yellow. And frankly, I have seen a little bit more chlorosis this year than I have seen in the past. I am used to seeing chlorosis on pin oaks. I got pin oaks growing on my farm back in a fence row that just look beautiful. But people put pin oaks in their yard, and when they grow them in their yard and then they water the grass, there is enough calcium in that water that it causes the pH of the lawn to increase, especially sandy lawns. You think sandy lawns would be acid. It doesn't take much calcium on sand to change that pH. And so those pHs of those lawns have increased, and pin oaks like an acid soil. If they don't have an acid soil, they have an iron deficiency, and what chlorosis is an iron deficiency. And so I actually saw it the other day on some swamp white oak. Not seen that happen before, but I also can see that same thing on a red maple tree. They'll get that same thing. Those red maple trees are kind of swampy trees, grow in low areas. They like an acid soil, and so you'll see that yellowing of the leaf with the green veins. In the case of the red maple, it is not an iron deficiency, but a manganese deficiency. The answer for all this is check your soil pH, and if your soil pH is high, which it will be, you need to put sulfur, pure sulfur, not aluminum sulfate, but pure sulfur out there. Spread it on that lawn, and you got to watch you don't put too much on because it can burn the grass. But you can do that in the fall and do it in the spring and continue doing a little bit year after year of sulfur. You can buy it as little prills, you can buy it as yellow powder, whatever it might be out there. You can use 2-3 pounds per 1,000 square feet, which is a light dose, and just keep doing it over and over again. If you really got a sick tree, you might put some holes down the ground and put some sulfur in there below the grass so it can change the pH without messing up your grass. Iron sulfate will help too. You can buy iron sulfate probably at a feed mill. They can get iron sulfate for you, and that can be spread on there too in the case of a pin oak. In the case of a red maple, the sulfur is what we need.
This next question, this person would like to know, can hairy mountain mint be divided and transplanted fairly easily? And if so, when is the best time to transplant?
All right, I'm not familiar with hairy mountain mint, but if it's in a mint category, there shouldn't be an issue with trying to divide that out and transplanting it out. And you could do it now, or like a lot of things, springtime is always a great time to transplant stuff. Maybe one of the other educators might be more familiar with that plant.
I'm not exactly familiar with the hairy mountain mint, but I know we have some mint around our house. And yeah, there's no trouble in transplanting that, even in the middle of a drought situation. My son actually wanted to grow some more mint of his own, so he took some and planted it somewhere else, and now I've got mint in 2 places. So it takes off pretty easily.
Yeah, I have seen mint really take off, and I thought it was interesting one time. I thought this was neat looking. Somebody took those clay flue tiles, they call it, that goes inside the chimneys, and used that, put those in the ground, put the mint in there, and had it coming up out of the ground a little bit so that the mint wouldn't take off and spread. I thought it just looked very beautiful. I don't know how practical it ended up being, but I thought it was very beautiful.
Our next question is, will weed killer kill earthworms under the ground?
So no. I'll let Jeff chime in on this a little bit too, but two different types of mode of action as weed killers and what we deal with earthworms. So Jeff, maybe I'll let you answer that if you'd like.
Yeah, so a lot of times if it's a herbicide taking care of plants, most of the times those chemicals are affecting the chlorophyll or the photosynthesis. And so I kind of learned early on, if it's a herbicide, it's disrupting that chlorophyll or that photosynthesis pathway. Worms do not photosynthesize, so that should not be an issue. But yeah, that's just kind of knowing your pests.
Little sidebar, earthworms are not native to our area. All the earthworms we have, especially night crawlers, have been brought into this country. Back when the glaciers went through 10,000 years ago, they wiped out all our earthworms. And so when the pioneers came into this area and took a look at those forests for the first time, they're not like the woods we're used to seeing now. They were just really fluffy because those earthworms come up, grab something to eat and drag it down, and they recycle it. So earthworms are great things, but they aren't one of those native things. It's kind of like honeybees, not native, but they are great things to have around. Now, some people would argue that in those forest situations, we need to go back to the fluffy, but it's not there. So, Jeff, this is one that I see happen, and I got a call on it the other day, lumpy yard. They go out in the yard, and they say, I've got a lumpy yard. Well, what's wrong with my yard? I walk across and it's lumpy. That's the earthworms coming up and building their little earthworm mounds. And if you get down on your belly and lay down there and look at it and pull the dirt away, you can actually see the channels where those earthworms are going back into that yard. So a healthy lawn will actually have little bumps in it.
Well, and Mark, are those, I mean, I'm thinking of a golf course setting, and after a really wet day or when the worms are having a good time, they'll make those casts.
Yep.
And so you get the greens mower out there and they're like, well, you know, it's late enough, the worms will be back in their hole, but they're like miniature anthills, real miniature anthills. But yeah, they do a good job on those really shortly mown lawns.
Yeah, they don't like them on the greens there too well, I'm sure, but they do that. They're out in that. So if you got a lumpy yard, that's what you got.
So that catches us up on questions so far. So I think this would be a good opportunity to let Jeff go into some turf management.
All right, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can you guys see that okay? Should have a picture of perennials.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so I kind of went through my weeds, fertilizer, and seeding presentations. September, we are really entering the fall season in terms of your lawn. And you can get some really good things to happen. I've got the perennial weed life cycle up here. This is the dandelion. It's our poster child for weeds and turf. We talked about these back at our other Lunch and Learn series. Everyone typically cares about dandelions, not during this time of the year because they don't have that yellow flower or that big flush of yellow flowers. However, we are getting into prime time for treating dandelions and other perennial weeds in your lawn. So here's the dandelion. Some of them, I've seen a few more of the puffballs or the seed heads there on the top right. We'll still have some flowers going because dandelions do tend to put on flowers any time of the year. But when we get these seeds like this, we'd really like to, you know, keep those seed heads mown down, try to keep those seeds from maturing because the less seed we get in that seed bank is just going to help us in the future because there's always going to be pressure with wind and different things blowing those seeds around. And then this just shows about a 5-inch taproot. They can be deeper than that with dandelions. And why we're talking about perennials during this time of year is a lot of times when you put that herbicide down, that's going to be able to travel down into that root. They call them systemic herbicides. So that's one that can move from the surface of the leaf into the leaf through the different vascular tissues and then down into that root, which serves as a storage unit for that plant to regenerate in the spring or to regenerate after a not so good application of a herbicide. And then ground ivy, if you guys have this in your lawn, if you have a lawn care company, this is the time to be hitting this, because this, if you hit this in the spring, this is pushing a lot of nutrients out from, you know, whether it be a mother plant or just a central area. You really need to make sure that you're hitting this ground ivy this time of year. It just does a lot better with controlling. Your turf is not going to be hurt by that herbicide you're using. It's going to be a broadleaf herbicide, which I've got a few examples of those coming up. Someone had mentioned about crabgrass. This is when to apply pre-emergent herbicides. And crabgrass is this red titled summer annual, and that's going to be applied in February and June before germination. So if you have crabgrass right now, I put in the chat box, the best thing you can do is just keep your lawn mowed and keep that from producing a lot of seed heads. If you have seed heads this year, you're probably going to have plants next year, unless you do apply that pre-emergent. Winter annuals, you can see early September before germination, so with common chickweed. But we don't often use pre-emergence with broadleaves. I would say a better strategy would be to get a a fertilizer plan down to get your turf beefed up. And we don't typically use pre-emergence with perennials like dandelions, because they will regenerate from plants, so they come back every year from a mother plant, and the seeds don't happen quite as often. So here's another good thing. I'll try to just zip through it, but this is when to apply post-emergent broadleaf herbicides. So post-emergence means the plant is up already. You've got winter annuals like common chickweed. They're going to start germinating here in September, November. That means that, you know, our day length is getting shorter. We're going to have less heat stress. The temperatures are going to drop. And so those winter annuals are going to get hit. If they get hit between now and November, you're not going to have them lasting through the winter and then coming up in the spring. And then I'm going to jump down to perennials. We say fall applications work best. And so this is what we call cultural control. We are changing our calendar. We're just changing a timing thing and not necessarily what we're putting down. If you're a lawn care company, or if you're putting down a 3-way herbicide in the spring, if you apply that same 3-way herbicide in the fall, you're going to get as good, if not better, control of your plants. So I tell a lot of people, well, if you don't want to spend so much money, do one application in the fall, and then if you have to come back in the spring and hit some spots, that's a little bit better than, you know, letting these plants go through all the summer, get beefed up a little bit, and then produce seeds. So if you get to spray between now and November, or before we get those cooler temperatures, you'll take care of both winter annuals and perennials. And then we've got perennials. The second best timing is late April and May. And then the summer annuals, just hitting those, when that seedling stage. They do better when they get controlled, when they're smaller. So now is not the time to be thinking about summer annuals like crabgrass or your prostrate spurge, because they're kind of done with their life cycle at this point. Okay, so this is just, this is a lot of list of what we were talking about in terms of chemical names. So when I'm talking about broadleaf herbicides, we're looking at 2,4-D, 2,4-DP, these kind of big picture stuff. If you have dandelions, get something with 2,4-D in it. I'm talking about 2,4-D in the amine formulation, not necessarily in the ester formulation. Those esters are a little more, what I want to say, hot, so they can maybe travel off target a little easier. That 2,4-D amine works really well, and so does the MCPP and the MCPA. Dicamba, you know, this one's kind of got a big issue these days in ag with volatilization and moving off target. But if you have a clover issue, dicamba, a 3-way herbicide with dicamba will actually take care of that clover pretty well. And then you get into these, I forget how to pronounce that one, picloclin acids. That's going to be your triclopirs, clopyralids. You guys have heard me mention those quite a bit on those hard to control weeds. And then you've got your quinclorac at the bottom. That's stuff that has a little bit of broadleaf control, can control some crabgrass, but that's one we're not really using this time of year. And before, just one last bit on herbicides. Where I'm at in Wabash County, sort of north central Indiana, I probably wouldn't be spraying anything right now because that turf is very stressed. If we get some more cooler temperatures, if we get some more rain, and that I want to spray when that turf is very low stress. That's just going to help it from, you know, burning up, getting a salt burn, anything like that. And that also means that your weeds are actually going to be chugging along as well. But if you're spraying for those broadleaf weeds and they're growing better, you need to have that weed growing well in order for that herbicide to work. So I might not necessarily spray, you know, today, the 1st of September, but give it 2 or 3 weeks, you know, cooler nights and some rainfall. Your lawn's going to be looking good. It might be time to go out and hit those weeds while the lawn is looking good. This is for seeding. Late August into mid-September is optimum for cool grass seeding. When I say cool grass, I'm talking turf type tall fescues. I'm talking about Kentucky bluegrass. I'll mention perennial ryegrass, but that's not something we recommend just because perennial ryegrass is one that does have perennial in its name. It will come back every year, but it does not do well in extreme cold or extreme hot. And then we have the reasons why it's good to do that seeding this time of year. Little competition with weed, warm soils, adequate rain. And then if you can get them in now, they'll have the whole month of September, or at least the whole part of September and most of October until we get those cooler temperatures where they start to go dormant in the winter. This I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. We're recording this, so you can always fall back on this chart, and I had shared it in our past lunch and learns as well. And then fertilizer. So September is the most important. So this, again, we've talked about herbicides, we've talked about seeding rates, and now we're talking about fertilizer. September, this is the month to be working on your lawn. You've got this nice big window from September to October, November. If you can get some fertilizer down now, those grass plants are going to use that on a very low stress situation with where we are in the fall. And then if you can get another one out October or November, and then third application would be in May. Because what you're doing is you're basically filling up the gas tank for those plants to get through the winter. They'll green up real nice with the typical spring moisture and temperatures. And then as they start to be a little more stressed, that's when you'd hit the May application. I'm going to zip through this. We talked about it in another lunch and learn. But for now, I think that covers a lot of what I wanted to cover as far as your lawn. Because again, if it were me, I would maybe hold off. I would probably fertilize first and then look at where my weeds are at. If I have a lot of weeds, I might decide to control weeds. If I needed to reseed, I would either pick between reseeding or killing weeds. You know, it's just kind of personal preference. But I would rather not spray a herbicide on new seedlings. You can, and how my sort of how I've learned it is if you can mow that grass twice after it has been seeded, then you will be able to get a herbicide down. But that's just something kind of how I roll. Sorry, I kind of blasted through that. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, there were a couple that came through. You talked about the spurge, and how can you kind of get ahead of controlling that? I know you said that wasn't something to worry about now, but as they move into springtime, how can they get ahead of that?
Sorry, phones. Getting ahead of that, that's one that's going to be get your lawn beefed up. So by that, work on a fertilizer program, maybe do some reseeding, because with those, they're going to take the stressed lawn as an opportunity. And when a lawn gets stressed, there's going to be more open space. So the less sunshine you have hitting the soil, the less seed is going to germinate. So I would say maybe if you have something like that, maybe try to do a reseeding program in the fall. If not the fall, then in the spring, to try to get as dense lawn as you can. Again, we're at a really good time to do reseeding and fertilization. So that's kind of where I would sit on that. If you wanted to get those in the summer, because those will kind of start germinating in June or July, You could always go out there with the broadleaf herbicide and try to spot treat, but you might have better control with getting your lawn more beefed up.
The next question is, how do you kill daylilies?
I use a shovel. That's how I usually go about them. If they're in a flower bed, you can always use glyphosate, as Mark had mentioned. But yeah, daylilies are one of those that I prefer to just dig them out because they are usually so hardy. They do a good job of staying alive.
Okay, and the next question is, what is your opinion of weed and feed products?
That's a really good question. I'll try to censor myself a little bit. What I would say with weed and feed is that, sorry, phone's going off. If you're doing a weed and feed for crabgrass in the spring, I'd say yes, that's really good. I like the idea of getting a crabgrass preventer in with your spring fertilization. A weed and feed for your dandelions, I sort of have an aversion to. I prefer, if I have dandelions or a broadleaf weed, I'm going to want to put down a liquid herbicide in the fall, because those dry products on weed and feed, if you don't have moisture on that leaf plant when you put the weed and feed down, if you don't have moisture on the leaf, it will not enter the plant. So you're getting the fertilization, that's good, it's getting to the soil. But if you don't have dew or it hasn't just rained, a lot of times that weed and feed doesn't work as well. So I think there are good places for weed and feed for things like crabgrass, but as far as your broadleafs, I would rather fertilize separately and then apply the herbicides separately. But if you have luck with it, that's great. I think Scott's has a lot of that stuff, and I've even seen the commercial where you see the pellet or the prill hitting the dandelion leaf. That's all good and well, but if that leaf's not wet, you're not going to get that herbicide in the plant. Hopefully that makes sense. That's an opinion of mine. I just know it works better. So, anything else?
That is all I've got in the chat box. Does anyone have any last minute questions before we get ready to wrap up? Okay, then.
I guess, Stephanie, we've got the survey coming out, and we really appreciate everyone coming out on this specific talk, because we had it kind of open-ended, and you guys had some really good questions, especially with the lawn side, and Mark did a great job with the trees and everything. So let us know what you think about these kind of sessions, if you would do more of them. So this one we did September 1st. I was able to cover quite a bit with the lawn care, and Mark was able to cover quite a bit with the trees. If you guys would want something like this, maybe in the spring and in the summer, or maybe just one a year, because these are things that, you know, I don't want to speak too forward with our group here, but we could put these on maybe a little more often than we have in the past.
I want to follow up with something that Jeff said. I've always said if I was campaigning for president of the United States, if elected, I would declare September National Lawn Month, because there's a lot of things you can do to your lawn in the month of September. A lot of great things you can do, as long as you got some moisture to go along with it. Several years ago, I found out there is a National Lawn Month, and it's in April. So that's when all the guys are out there trying to sell you fertilizer. And just because it's available and it's on the market doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. And that's where we come in at as Extension. We try to get the scientific based answers to a lot of things, and we'd be happy to talk to you with them about them.
Mark, I would vote for you since you said September.
It is the best month to get things done on your lawn. So with that, Stephanie or Krista, whichever one.
All right, and Jeff alluded to that you will be getting a survey, and thank you for those who are sharing a little bit of feedback in the chat box. If you could go ahead and also fill out that survey so we can have all of our data collected, that will help guide our future programming. So thank you for today's speakers, and thank you all for the questions. And with that, I guess this will wrap up our Lunch and Learn series that we've been doing the last few weeks. So thank you so much for your participation, and hopefully to catch you on another program. Have a good day.